My name is Nia. On my 30th birthday, my parents took me to dinner at the most exclusive club in Atlanta and announced I was adopted. Then they slid a stack of legal papers across the table and told me I was officially cut out of the family trust. They expected tears. They expected me to beg. I did not cry. I simply took a sip of my bourbon, smiled, and said, "That is interesting because my real family is sitting exactly 3 tables behind you." The moment they turned around, all the color drained from their faces. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic people out of your life. Growing up in the Caldwell mansion meant absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling estate, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our home was a fortress of impossible expectations that I could never quite meet. The atmosphere inside the Commerce Club tonight felt exactly like my childhood, suffocatingly elegant and entirely fake. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over our private dining area. A string quartet played classical music softly in the background, blending with the clinking of heavy silver and the hushed conversations of Atlanta high society. I sat perfectly still on a plush velvet sofa, my fingers wrapped tightly around a crystal glass filled with aged bourbon. I watched a waiter glide across the polished marble floor. He was navigating the opulent room with practiced grace, heading straight for our table carrying a silver tray. On that tray rested a small black leather folder. The bill. The Caldwell family did not do anything quietly. My adoptive father, Marcus Sr., a man who had built a massive real estate empire out of ruthless acquisitions and political intimidation, sat at the head of the table. He was swirling a glass of very expensive red wine, his face set in a hard, disapproving line whenever he looked in my direction. To his right sat Vivian, the woman I had called mother for 2.5 decades. She was the reigning queen of her church congregation, a woman whose entire existence revolved around maintaining an impeccable public image, wearing the latest designer clothes, and exercising absolute control over her children. To her left sat my older sister Chloe, the undisputed golden child. Chloe had been groomed from birth to be the perfect socialite, a flawless reflection of Vivian and her relentless social climbing ambitions. She sat there radiating entitlement, her posture rigidly straight, her smile practiced and entirely cold. And then there was Preston. Preston was Chloe's husband, a Wall Street investment banker who had married into the Caldwell family and brought with him an air of white privilege and unearned superiority. He sat next to Chloe, exuding pure arrogance, his eyes scanning the room as if his mere presence elevated the establishment. I was the anomaly. I had adamantly refused to pledge the elite sorority that Vivienne considered a mandatory rite of passage for any respectable woman in our circle. I had completely rejected Marcus and his loud demands to join the family real estate business, opting instead to study finance on my own terms. To them, I was just a lowly number cruncher, a stubborn, ungrateful daughter who refused to conform to their extravagant lifestyle. They had absolutely no idea that I was a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. They did not know my daily job involved dismantling fraudulent financial empires, tracking illegal money trails, and tearing down corrupt people exactly like them. To them, I was just Nia, the massive disappointment. The waiter reached our table and placed the black leather folder precisely in the center, offering a polite bow before quickly retreating into the shadows. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved a single muscle. The string quartet continued to play the cheerful melody, feeling entirely disconnected from the toxic energy suffocating our table. Then Vivian reached into her oversized designer handbag. She did not reach for her platinum credit card. Instead, she forcefully pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal papers. The edges were slightly crumpled, and a dark red wine stain marred the top corner of the first page. She tossed the heavy document onto my porcelain dinner plate. The sharp smack of paper against fine china echoed in the quiet room, drawing the curious attention of nearby diners. I looked down at the bold, capitalized black letters dominating the top of the first page. It was a legally binding declaration of total disinheritance. "We are officially removing you from the family trust," Nia Vivian announced. Her voice was perfectly steady, coldly modulated, carrying the terrifying calm of a woman who felt absolute justification in her extreme cruelty. "You were a tragic mistake. An error in our judgment that we adopted out of pure charity and misplaced pity. We gave you absolutely everything. We provided a massive roof over your head, a highly elite education, and a respected social standing you could never have achieved on your own." She leaned forward aggressively, her manicured nails tapping loudly against the wine-stained paper. "And how exactly do you repay us? By constantly rejecting our traditions. By stubbornly refusing to join my prestigious sorority, bringing shame to my name among the other women. By wearing your hair in those natural styles that make you look so unkempt at my formal dinners. By choosing a mediocre, embarrassing career instead of graciously taking your rightful place within the family business. You are a constant embarrassment to this family, and we are entirely done pretending otherwise. Sign the documents immediately. Relinquish any claim to the Caldwell family name and our extensive financial assets. We are permanently severing all ties effective right this second." I looked up from the stained papers to Vivian and then over to Marcus. My adoptive father did not even try to meet my eyes. He simply took another slow sip of his rich wine, tacitly endorsing his wife in her brutal declaration. Chloe lazily adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, looking incredibly bored by the entire dramatic ordeal, as if disposing of a family member was merely an annoying chore, temporarily interrupting her luxurious evening. Before I could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of their sudden betrayal, Preston cheerfully decided it was his turn to gleefully twist the knife deeper. He leaned far across the table, a nasty condescending smirk playing openly on his thin lips. He looked directly at me with the kind of unfiltered disdain that only comes from someone who truly believes they are fundamentally superior by simple birthright. "Just sign the papers," Nia Preston sneered, his loud voice dripping with condescension. "Marcus and Vivian have wasted an absolute fortune raising you. They poured millions of dollars into trying to make you respectable, and you selfishly chose to throw it all away just to be a glorified calculator. Honestly, you should be extremely grateful they even kept you around this long. You are literally nothing but a diversity hire in the corporate world." He let out a short, mocking laugh that grated terribly against my ears. "At my Wall Street firm, diversity hires exactly like you do not last a single week. You completely lack the pedigree, the drive, and the basic intelligence required to actually survive in a real competitive business environment. You actually think your little accounting job makes you special. You are entirely replaceable. You are a nobody who brings nothing to the table." Preston reached out and flicked the black leather folder containing the restaurant bill toward me. It slid across the smooth white tablecloth and hit my water glass with a heavy thud. "Since you are officially no longer a Caldwell, you can cover your own expenses from now on." Preston continued, crossing his arms casually over his chest. "Starting with tonight, settle the bill for your farewell party. It is $18,000. I hope that lowly accountant's salary comes with a high-limit credit card. Pay the bill, sign the papers, and get out of our sight forever." His vicious words were intentionally designed to crush me. They fully expected me to break down, to desperately cry and beg for my place back in their opulent world. They eagerly anticipated a spectacular emotional collapse right there in the middle of the Commerce Club. They wanted to see me broken, humiliated, and utterly destroyed by their rejection. I did not give them the satisfaction. I calmly picked up the expensive fountain pen Vivian had tossed onto the table alongside the legal documents. I held it up to the light, inspecting the gold nib for a brief moment before casually tossing it back onto the table. It clattered against the plate, a loud sound of pure defiance. I picked up my crystal glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon, letting the fiery warmth spread through my chest and steady my nerves. I set the glass down gently and looked directly into Preston and his arrogant eyes, then shifted my gaze to Vivian and Marcus. "I will not be signing those documents," I said, my voice eerily calm and carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "And I certainly will not be paying that absurd bill." I leaned back against the plush velvet sofa and allowed a genuine, bright smile to touch my lips. The absolute shock beginning to ripple across their smug features was intoxicating. It is actually quite fascinating that you confidently claim, "I do not belong in this family." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of the fear they wanted to see. "Because my real family is sitting exactly 3 tables behind you." The moment those final words left my mouth, Vivian, Marcus, Chloe, and Preston all slowly turned their rigid heads to look behind them. The four of them turned their heads in unison. The heavy silence of the private dining room was suddenly shattered by the sharp scraping of chair legs against the polished marble floor. Sitting exactly 3 tables away, bathed in the soft glow of a crystal chandelier, was federal judge Rosalind Montgomery. She was a legend in Georgia, a woman whose brilliant legal mind and unwavering authority had dismantled corrupt politicians and ruthless corporate monopolies alike. She stood up slowly, leaning her weight onto a polished silver-handled cane. Flanking her immediately were 2 tall, broad-shouldered men with striking features and eyes that locked onto the Caldwell family with pure, predatory focus. Malik and Tariq, my brothers. The blood drained from Vivian's face so fast she looked like a ghost. Her perfectly manicured hand spasmed, knocking against her wineglass. The expensive red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, like a fresh wound, the crystal shattering onto the floor. Marcus Sr. gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. Even in their arrogant delusion, they recognized true power. They knew exactly who Rosalind Montgomery was, but the sheer panic radiating from their bodies told me they also recognized something much deeper and far more terrifying. Rosalind took a step forward. The sharp click of her cane against the marble echoed like a gavel demanding order. Malik and Tariq moved perfectly in sync with her, their presence creating a suffocating wall of authority that made the air in the room feel incredibly thin. Vivian scrambled to her feet, her chair tipping backward. Her voice trembled completely, devoid of the icy control she had wielded just moments ago. "Judge Montgomery," she stammered frantically, trying to arrange her face into a mask of respectful deference. "What an unexpected honor. Please excuse the disruption. Nia is just having one of her emotional episodes. She has always been prone to these delusions. You see, we took her in when she was nothing. She was an abandoned charity case from the most run-down orphanage in Fulton County. We are good Christian people who gave her a beautiful life, and she is simply lashing out because she cannot handle the pressure of our world." Marcus quickly stood up, attempting to puff out his chest and reclaim his role as the untouchable patriarch. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus interjected, offering a stiff, nervous bow. "We sincerely apologize for our ungrateful daughter making a scene in your presence. We were just handling a private family matter. We adopted her out of the goodness of our hearts, but some people simply cannot be saved from their own inherent flaws." Rosalind Montgomery did not look at Marcus. She did not even acknowledge his existence. She stopped directly at the head of our table and stared down at Vivian. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. Then Rosalind raised her cane slightly and brought it down hard against the marble floor. The sharp crack made Chloe flinch and sink lower into her chair. "You did not save her," Vivian, Rosalind said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, chilling resonance that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "You stole her." Vivian gasped, taking a stumbling step backward until she hit the wall. Her hands flew to her throat. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered, her eyes darting wildly toward the exits. "Oh, I think you remember perfectly well," Rosalind continued, stepping closer, her gaze pinning Vivian like a specimen under glass. "Let us take a walk down memory lane to a stormy night 25 years ago. I was in a horrific car accident on Interstate 20. I was pulled from the wreckage and rushed to Atlanta General Hospital, where I slipped into a coma that lasted for 6 agonizing months. My beautiful, perfectly healthy baby girl was in the back seat. She survived without a single scratch." Rosalind leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with decades of suppressed rage. "You were not a wealthy socialite back then, were you, Vivian? You were Vivian Stokes, a lowly medical records clerk working the night shift, drowning in massive credit card debt, and facing imminent eviction. You saw a wealthy, incapacitated black woman and a vulnerable infant. But more importantly, You saw the emergency medical file. You saw the Montgomery family trust documents. You saw that whoever became the temporary legal guardian of my daughter would receive a monthly care stipend of $25,000 until I recovered. Marcus let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He looked like he wanted to run, but Malik smoothly stepped into his path, blocking any chance of escape. You forged the hospital transfer documents. Rosalind stated each word, striking like a physical blow. You manipulated the chaotic county foster system using your insider access. You made sure my daughter was placed directly into your custody before my extended family could even be located. And then you legally finalized the adoption through a corrupt judge who was later disbarred. You did not rescue a child from a rundown orphanage out of Christian charity. You orchestrated a kidnapping to steal a child for a monthly paycheck. The math exploded in my head. My forensic accountant brain automatically calculated the numbers: $25,000 a month, $300,000 a year. Over 25 years, that was $7.5 million. Suddenly, every single piece of my twisted childhood made perfect sense. It explained why Marcus and Vivian had suddenly been able to afford the seed money to launch his real estate empire right around the time I was adopted. It explained why they had always treated me like a burdensome employee rather than a daughter. It explained why they never actually let me leave forcefully, keeping me under their roof and tied to their accounts. I was not their charity case. I was their primary source of income. I was the financial foundation upon which they had built their entire fake glamorous lives. Malik stepped forward, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fury as he looked down at Marcus. You used my sister to buy your first 3 commercial properties, he said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. We have tracked every single wire transfer, every single fraudulent withdrawal. We know exactly how you washed the trust money through your shell companies. Tariq crossed his arms, staring at Chloe, who was now trembling uncontrollably, her diamond necklace suddenly looking like a very cheap collar. Did you really think you could disinherit the actual source of your wealth? Tariq asked, a dark, mocking smile on his face. My sister is a federal forensic accountant. She has been pulling the threads on your fake empire for 6 months. She already knew the numbers did not add up. She just needed us to provide the missing context. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute devastation raining down on the Caldwell family. I remembered the nights I had cried myself to sleep, wondering why I was so unlovable, wondering why my adoptive parents looked at me with such cold, calculating eyes. They had never seen a child. They had only ever seen a deposit slip. They had stolen my mother, my brothers, and my true identity, all to buy their way into a country club. The air in the room was thick with impending ruin. Vivian was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she gripped the wall to keep from collapsing. Marcus looked like a cornered animal, frantically looking around for a way out of a trap that had been set 25 years ago. Their social destruction was absolute and their legal destruction was only just beginning. But Preston, blinded by his own massive ego and completely oblivious to the lethal reality of the situation, decided this was his moment to take control. He could not stand seeing the people who funded his lavish lifestyle being dismantled. He could not comprehend a world where a black woman, even a federal judge, could hold this much power over his white shoe existence. Preston forcefully pushed his chair back and stood up, straightening his expensive Italian silk tie. He puffed out his chest and adopted his loudest, most aggressive boardroom voice, the one he used to intimidate junior analysts on Wall Street. Now you listen to me, Preston shouted, pointing a bold, accusing finger directly at Judge Montgomery. I do not care who you think you are or what wild conspiracy theories you have cooked up. You cannot just walk into a private club and launch defamatory accusations against prominent citizens. Marcus and Vivian are respected pillars of the Atlanta business community. Malik and Tariq slowly turned their heads toward Preston. The sheer disbelief on their faces would have been funny if the situation were not so volatile. Rosalind did not even blink. She merely raised a single elegant eyebrow, waiting for the arrogant man to finish digging his own grave. I am a senior vice president at a major investment bank. Preston continued, stepping out from behind the table, his face flushed with misplaced righteous indignation. I have the best lawyers in the country on speed dial. If you do not leave this establishment immediately, I will personally see to it that you are sued for slander, harassment, and emotional distress. I will call the police right now and have you arrested for trespassing and threatening my family. You are messing with the wrong people. Do you have any idea who I am? Preston slammed his hand down onto the linen tablecloth so hard, the crystal water glasses rattled violently against the fine china. The loud, aggressive thud echoed through the private dining room, causing several patrons at nearby tables to turn their heads in sudden alarm. But Preston did not care who was watching. He was a man accustomed to bullying his way out of any inconvenient situation, fully relying on his extreme wealth to shield him from the consequences of his actions. You think a piece of carved wood and a black judicial robe gives you the right to interrogate me, Preston shouted, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of crimson. A thick vein pulsed rapidly at his temple as he glared at Judge Montgomery. I am the managing director at Apex Wealth. I control hundreds of millions of dollars. I personally manage the entire Caldwell financial portfolio. I am the one who dictates who gets paid and who starves in this family. And as of right now, I am officially freezing every single bank account associated with your name, Nia. You will not have access to a single dime. I am going to bury you in so much litigation for this slanderous stunt that you will be spending the rest of your miserable life scrubbing floors just to pay my legal fees. Chloe let out a sharp, brittle laugh, eagerly jumping in to support her husband and his ruthless tirade. She tossed her long dark hair over her shoulder and glared at me with absolute unmasked contempt. You really overplayed your hand this time, Nia. She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. You actually brought actors into a private club to stage a fake rescue mission. It is beyond pathetic. You are nothing but a glorified bookkeeper who barely makes enough money to afford that depressing little apartment of yours. Did you really think your basic math skills could somehow intimidate a Wall Street executive? You are completely delusional. Preston is going to absolutely ruin you, and you brought it entirely on yourself. I did not rush to answer. I let their petty insults hang in the heavy air, absorbing their desperate flailing attempts to maintain their fabricated dominance over me. Then very slowly I pushed my chair back and stood up. As I rose to my full height, I kept my eyes locked dead onto Preston. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. From my new standing vantage point, looking down at him sitting in his expensive chair, the illusion of his immense power completely evaporated. He suddenly did not look like a terrifying corporate titan. He looked like a small, panicked, fragile little boy drowning in an oversized suit. My true mother, Judge Rosalind Montgomery, stood silently behind me, like an immovable pillar of absolute justice, while my brothers Malik and Tariq flanked me, radiating a silent, lethal strength. I was no longer the isolated, unwanted orphan they could bully into submission. I was a force of nature backed by a wall of untouchable power. Do you actually believe I just sit in a gray cubicle and type numbers into a spreadsheet, Preston? I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet, yet it cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant with razor-sharp precision. Do you really think my job consists of balancing petty cash and filing basic tax returns? I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a sleek encrypted silver USB drive. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the warm light of the crystal chandelier catch its metallic surface before I dropped it directly onto the center of his empty porcelain dinner plate. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that made Preston physically flinch backward. I am not a basic bookkeeper, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. I am a senior forensic financial accountant, working directly for the federal government. My security clearance is higher than your chief executive officer. My entire career is dedicated to hunting down arrogant, sloppy white-collar criminals who think they are untouchable. Criminals exactly like you, Preston. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks instantly drained away, replaced by a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted nervously to the silver USB drive resting on his plate, as if it were a live explosive device ticking down to zero. I did not just notice a few minor discrepancies in the Caldwell accounts. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to the table, forcing him to lean even further back away from me. I spent the last 6 months systematically tearing apart the entire financial infrastructure of Apex Wealth. I tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer you ever authorized. I traced the phantom client accounts you set up in the Cayman Islands. I mapped the incredibly lazy network of shell companies you created in Delaware to hide your massive embezzlement. You thought you were being so clever by moving small increments of cash across multiple dummy corporations, but you left a digital footprint so wide and so painfully obvious that a first-year accounting student could have flagged it. Marcus Sr. let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He grabbed his chest, his eyes widening in pure absolute terror as he realized what my words meant for his own dirty money. If I had dismantled Apex Wealth, I had dismantled his corrupt real estate empire right along with it. I algorithmicized your entire black ledger. Preston, I told him, leaning over the table, bringing my face uncomfortably close to his sweating forehead. I mathematically proved exactly how you have been siphoning millions of dollars from your own clients to secretly fund your high-risk offshore gambling debts. I know about the profit margins you blatantly fabricated. I know about the regulatory audits you falsified to keep your board of directors happy. I know every single dirty secret you thought you buried safely behind corporate firewalls. Preston swallowed hard. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. His hands, which had been balled into aggressive fists just moments ago, were now visibly trembling on his lap. "You are lying," he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "You cannot legally access those files. That is proprietary corporate data protected by strict confidentiality agreements. You have absolutely no proof." "I do not need to lie," I smiled, offering a cold, predatory expression that promised absolutely no mercy. "And I do not need your permission to access anything. I had a federal subpoena. That USB drive is just a courtesy copy for you to review while you wait for the authorities to arrive. Because right now, at this exact second, while you sit here drinking expensive red wine and threatening my family, a joint task force from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation is actively raiding the downtown offices of Apex Wealth. They are seizing your private servers, they are confiscating your hard drives, and they are freezing every single bank account associated with your name. You are not freezing my money tonight, Preston. The federal government has already frozen yours." The silence that fell over the table was absolute and entirely suffocating. The crushing reality of his total destruction was settling heavily over his shoulders. He was going to federal prison, and he knew it without a shadow of a doubt. There were no lawyers expensive enough, no political connections powerful enough to save him from the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I had handed directly to the federal authorities. But I was not quite finished. I slowly turned my gaze away from the broken, sweating man and locked eyes with Chloe. My sister had stopped laughing entirely. She sat frozen rigidly in her chair, her designer purse clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes darting frantically between me and her terrified husband. She was watching her glamorous, perfectly curated life evaporate before her very eyes, but she still did not know the most devastating truth of all. The federal crimes, the corporate embezzlement, the illegal offshore accounts, I said softly, my voice dripping with deceptive sympathy as I looked deeply into Chloe and her panicked eyes. Those will guarantee Preston spends the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. But honestly, Chloe, the financial treason against his company is not even the most interesting thing I found hidden inside his black ledger. Chloe blinked, her breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice barely a desperate squeak. "What else could there possibly be?" Preston suddenly lurched forward, his hands reaching out toward me in a desperate, panicked frenzy. "Nia, shut up!" he screamed, his voice shattering into a high, hysterical pitch. "Do not say another word. I will give you whatever you want. Just shut your mouth right now." Malik stepped forward instantly, his large, heavy hand clamping down hard on Preston, and his shoulder violently forcing the man back down into his seat. "Do not move," my brother commanded, his voice dark and lethal. Preston immediately slumped back, whimpering softly in absolute defeat. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Chloe, relishing the sheer, unfiltered panic radiating from her perfect, unblemished face. 2 months ago, Preston authorized a highly restricted wire transfer, I explained, speaking slowly and deliberately, so she would absorb every single agonizing syllable. He moved exactly $2.5 million out of your personal private inheritance trust. He forged your signature on the authorization forms to completely bypass the bank and their security protocols. Chloe shook her head wildly, vehemently refusing to believe it. No, that is impossible, she stammered, looking at Preston for a confirmation or a denial that never came. He told me he was moving that money into a high-yield commercial real estate venture in Miami. He promised me it was an exclusive investment opportunity guaranteed to double my trust within a year. He did send the money to Miami. I nodded, maintaining my calm, authoritative tone. He wired the funds directly to a limited liability company registered under a residential address in South Beach. But it was not a commercial real estate investment, Chloe, and it certainly was not meant to double your trust fund. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands firmly on the edge of the table, closing the distance between me and the sister who had treated me like disposable dirt her entire life. I tracked the deed of the property purchased by that specific shell company, I whispered, delivering the final crushing blow. Preston used your personal inheritance money to buy a luxury oceanfront penthouse. A penthouse that is legally deeded to a 24-year-old cocktail waitress named Isabella. The exact same woman he has been secretly flying to Florida to visit every single weekend for the past year. The absolute silence in the private dining room shattered the moment my words registered in Chloe's brain. My attention shifted rapidly back and forth between them, taking in the spectacular destruction of their perfect facade. I looked at Preston, whose face was chalky, his skin slick with a sudden layer of cold, terrified sweat. I looked at Chloe, whose eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route from this nightmare. Back to Preston, who was visibly vibrating his chest, heaving with cornered, desperate panic. Back to Chloe, whose flawless, heavily curated composure was fracturing into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. For a fraction of a second, the pristine mask of the Caldwell golden child completely cracked, revealing the deeply insecure, terrified woman trembling underneath. But years of Vivian's intense social conditioning instantly kicked in. Chloe could not process the fact that her husband was a criminal who had stolen from her, so her mind instinctively chose the only defense mechanism it knew. She chose to attack me. Her expression rapidly morphed from devastating shock to explosive, venomous rage. Chloe slammed both of her manicured hands flat against the white linen tablecloth, rattling the fine china and spilling her own glass of sparkling water. She shot up from her chair, leaning over the table, her face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly hatred. "You are a pathological liar!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing loudly off the marble walls of the exclusive restaurant. "You made all of this up. You fabricated these disgusting lies because you are nothing but a deeply jealous, bitter, unwanted orphan. You have always been insanely jealous of my life. You are entirely obsessed with my magazine perfect marriage because you know you could never ever land a high-value man like Preston." She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. "You are a lonely, miserable spinster who sits in a gray cubicle all day. You cannot stand the fact that I am beautiful, that I am successful, and that I have a husband who absolutely adores me. So you cooked up this pathetic, desperate little spreadsheet fantasy to try and drag me down to your miserable level. Preston is a senior executive. He is a brilliant financial mind. He loves me. He would never do something so completely common. You are just a sad, pathetic diversity hire trying to ruin your betters." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not let her aggressive classist insults touch me. The truth is always the loudest thing in the room, and I had brought an entire arsenal of it. I looked at her with an expression of absolute chilling pity. "I am not finished, Chloe," I stated, my voice slicing effortlessly through her hysterical screaming like a freshly sharpened blade. "You think the inheritance trust was the extent of his betrayal? You think he stopped at stealing the money Marcus and Vivian handed to you? I suggest you take a very deep breath, sister, because the reality of your perfect marriage is about to get much worse." I did not break eye contact with her as I recited the exact financial data that had kept me awake for the last 3 nights. Transaction number 8842. I read aloud, my tone clinical and perfectly measured. Initiated on October 12th at precisely 2:14 in the afternoon. A highly expedited, heavily encrypted wire transfer in the exact amount of $3.5 million. Chloe blinked, her mouth falling open slightly as the specific, undeniable details began to penetrate her wall of denial. But this money did not come from your personal inheritance trust. Chloe. I continued, my words striking her like physical blows. Preston completely drained that account 6 months ago. No, this specific transfer was pulled directly from the operating funds of your highly publicized boutique PR firm. The business you spent 5 years building, the company you thought you controlled. He liquidated your entire operational capital, effectively bankrupting your PR firm without your knowledge. Chloe let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked wildly at Preston, silently begging him to deny it, to tell her that this was all a massive misunderstanding. Preston could not even look at her. He was staring blindly at the silver USB drive resting on the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. And do you want to know exactly where your hard-earned business capital went? Chloe, I asked, leaning slightly forward. The beneficiary of transaction number 8842 was a newly formed shell company holding the deed to a massive luxury penthouse in Miami. A penthouse legally registered under the name of a 22-year-old white cocktail waitress. The exact same woman Preston has been funding for the entirety of your flawless magazine perfect marriage. Your husband did not just cheat on you, Chloe. He used your own business revenue to buy his young blonde mistress a multi-million-dollar beachfront playground. You bought that penthouse for her. Preston's mind finally snapped. The crushing weight of his absolute ruin, combined with the public exposure of his darkest secrets, completely overrode whatever remained of his logical thought process. The polished, arrogant Wall Street executive vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a desperate, cornered animal. He genuinely believed his white privilege and his expensive suit made him invincible, and he thought that if he could just physically eliminate the evidence, he could somehow force the terrifying reality to disappear. "Shut your mouth!" Preston roared, his voice cracking into a panicked, hysterical shriek. He lunged violently across the wide dining table, abandoning all pretense of civilization. His sudden, aggressive movement knocked over crystal wine glasses, sending a dark red tide of expensive vintage pouring across the pristine white tablecloth. He crashed through the fine china, sending heavy silver cutlery flying into the air, his hands clawing desperately toward the silver USB drive resting innocently on the table. He thought he could grab it, crush it, and somehow stop the federal investigation that was already tearing his life apart. He never even got close. Tariq moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking to witness. My brother did not hesitate. Before Preston's outstretched fingers could even brush the surface of the silver drive, Tariq surged forward from his position behind me. His movement was a blur of pure lethal physical power. Tariq grabbed Preston by his extended right wrist, his massive hand clamping down like an industrial steel vise. Preston let out a shocked, breathless yelp as Tariq effortlessly twisted his arm backward with terrifying precision, instantly neutralizing his momentum. Using Preston's own forward motion against him, Tariq shoved the struggling investment banker downward. With a sickening thud, Tariq slammed Preston face first directly into the center of the dining table. Preston's cheek crashed into a shattered crystal wine glass, and his expensive tailored suit absorbed the massive puddle of spilled red wine. Tariq leaned his considerable weight forward, pinning Preston flat against the ruined table, completely immobilizing him in front of the entire restaurant. Preston thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and letting out muffled, pathetic groans, but Tariq held him down with effortless, stoic ease. "Stay exactly where you are," Tariq warned, his deep voice rumbling with a dark, terrifying promise of violence. "You move one more muscle toward my sister, and I will snap your arm in half before the feds even get here to arrest you." Preston instantly went limp, weeping openly into the linen tablecloth, his arrogance utterly crushed beneath the physical and legal weight of his own actions. Chloe stood frozen, staring down at the pathetic, whining man she had married. The undeniable reality of his guilt was written all over his wine-soaked, terrified face. He had not fought back with facts. He had not threatened to call his lawyers to prove his innocence. He had panicked and lunged like a guilty, desperate thief. Her entire universe, built on status, wealth, and the illusion of a perfect marriage, had just been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. She looked at the silver USB drive. She looked at Tariq, who was holding her husband down like a misbehaving child. And then she looked at Preston's face, pressed humiliatingly against the table. Something completely wild and unhinged snapped behind Chloe's eyes. The polished socialite vanished. She stepped around the edge of the table, her breath coming in ragged, furious gasps. Tariq, sensing her movement, slightly eased his downward pressure on Preston, allowing the ruined man to lift his head just a few inches off the stained tablecloth. Preston looked up at his wife, his eyes wide and pleading, a pathetic apology forming on his lips. Chloe did not let him speak. She raised her right hand, her heavy diamond engagement ring catching the light of the chandelier, and delivered a devastating full-force slap directly across Preston's face. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm, connecting with his cheek, echoed like a gunshot through the opulent dining room. The sheer force of the blow snapped Preston's head to the side. Tariq completely released his grip at that exact moment, stepping back smoothly to let the drama unfold. Unmoored and entirely off balance from the violent strike, Preston tumbled backward off the edge of the table. He crashed heavily into a nearby wooden serving cart, sending a towering stack of porcelain dessert plates cascading down onto him in a deafening, chaotic crash. The Commerce Club erupted into complete pandemonium. Diners at surrounding tables leaped out of their seats, gasping in shock and pulling out their phones to record the unbelievable spectacle. Waiters froze in their tracks, completely unsure of how to handle the elite Caldwell family, violently imploding in the middle of their exclusive establishment. Amidst the screaming, the shattered china, and Preston whimpering on the floor covered in wine and broken plates, Marcus Sr. finally found his footing. The patriarch of the family, realizing that his entire pristine reputation, his fraudulent business empire, and his carefully controlled world were currently burning to the ground in public, stepped forward. His face was a mask of absolute murderous fury as he prepared to intervene. Looking past Marcus Sr.'s broad, tense shoulders, the view framed my face perfectly. I did not cower. I did not shrink back into the plush velvet sofa as I would have done a year ago, a month ago, or even an hour ago. Instead, a cold, calculating half-smile spread slowly across my lips. I held his furious, bloodshot gaze with absolute unblinking stillness. Marcus stepped deliberately over the shattered porcelain and spilled red wine that currently decorated his whimpering son-in-law. The entire dining room of the Commerce Club was completely paralyzed. Waiters stood frozen with silver trays in their hands. Wealthy patrons at neighboring tables held their breath, their expensive dinners entirely forgotten. The string quartet had ceased playing minutes ago, leaving only the sound of Preston's ragged breathing from the floor and the heavy, authoritative thud of Marcus Sr.'s expensive leather shoes advancing toward me. He stopped just 2 feet away, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence. He was a man who had spent 4 decades using his size, his loud voice, and his immense bank accounts to bully local politicians, bulldoze small business owners, and bend the entire city of Atlanta to his will. He looked at me, then shifted his furious glare to Judge Rosalind Montgomery, and finally to my brothers Malik and Tariq. "You think you have won because you caught an incompetent idiot stealing from his own company," Marcus boomed, his deep southern drawl vibrating with raw, unfiltered menace. He gestured dismissively toward Preston on the floor without even bothering to look down at him. "You think exposing that pathetic excuse for a man somehow touches me? I am Marcus Caldwell. I am the institution. I built this family's legacy with my bare hands, pulling it out of the dirt, and I will be damned if I let an ungrateful, mentally unstable orphan and a crippled federal judge walk into my private club and humiliate my blood." Vivienne let out a soft, frantic sob from against the wall, but Marcus ignored his wife entirely. His eyes were locked on me, burning with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute supreme arrogance. "You have made a fatal miscalculation tonight," Nia, Marcus sneered, leaning his heavy frame forward, trying to force me to break eye contact. "You actually believe you can weaponize the federal government against me. You think your little forensic accounting degree makes you a threat. Let me educate you on how the real world operates outside of your miserable little government cubicle. I own the best defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. I play golf with the mayor. I fund the re-election campaigns of half the judges in Fulton County, and I assure you they answer my calls before they answer yours." He took another step closer, his voice dropping into a vicious guttural growl meant to intimidate. I am going to unleash a legal team so vicious and so expensive that they will strip you of your federal credentials, revoke your precious security clearance, and leave you entirely bankrupt. And when I am done destroying you, I am going to systematically dismantle your new family. I will drag this judge's reputation through the mud. I will tie your brothers up in so much frivolous litigation they will not be able to afford their own names. You came into my city, you came into my club, and you tried to attack an untouchable empire. Marcus threw his arms out wide, gesturing to the opulent crystal-draped room around him, playing directly to the captive audience of Atlanta's elite. I own the entire West End, he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. I own the commercial districts, the residential complexes, the development permits. I control the zoning boards. I have this entire city securely in my pocket. I am a titan of real estate and you are absolutely nothing. I let his echo fade into the stunned silence of the dining room. I let him bask in his own perceived glory for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I watched the vein pulsing in his neck. I watched the absolute certainty in his eyes, the deep-seated belief that his white privilege, his wealth, and his loud voice made him a god among men. Then my calculating half-smile grew into a genuine radiant grin. You really are a dinosaur, Marcus, I said softly, shaking my head with exaggerated pity. You are fighting a digital war with a rusted sword. You think real estate empires are built on golf course handshakes and bribing local zoning officials. You think owning brick and mortar makes you a titan. But you fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of modern wealth. You do not own those buildings. The bank owns those buildings. You just own the debt. I raised my right hand and simply snapped my fingers. The sharp, crisp sound cracked through the air. Instantly, Malik stepped forward from the shadows behind me. My brother was not just a physically imposing enforcer. Malik Montgomery was one of the most ruthless and brilliant tech moguls in Silicon Valley, a man who built predictive algorithms that handled billions in venture capital. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a heavily modified matte black smartphone, and tapped the screen exactly 3 times. He did not need to ask the restaurant manager for permission. He did not need a remote control. Malik simply hijacked the Commerce Club's entire localized audiovisual network. The massive 80-inch flat-screen monitors mounted on the walls around the private dining area, screens normally reserved for displaying silent high-definition art or welcoming corporate sponsors, suddenly flickered. The digital artwork vanished instantly. In its place, the screens blazed to life with a blinding, stark white background. The entire restaurant gasped in unison as the monitors populated with highly classified, meticulously detailed financial spreadsheets. The numbers dominating the screens were massive, complex, and overwhelmingly printed in a bleeding, catastrophic shade of neon red. Flowcharts, loan origination documents, and deeply buried corporate ledgers were projected for every single wealthy patron in the room to see. I stepped out from behind the table, moving past my shattered crystal glass, and stood directly in front of Marcus Sr. The ambient light from the giant screens cast a harsh, unforgiving glow across his suddenly pale, sweating face. You love to brag about your flawless acquisitions in the West End, I said, my voice carrying, clearly echoing the absolute authority of a federal auditor delivering a death sentence. You love to tell the country club about your brilliant development strategies. But your strategies are not brilliant, Marcus. They are desperate, reckless, and entirely fraudulent. I gestured toward the massive screen behind him. 3 years ago, your flagship commercial project in Midtown hemorrhaged money. Your contractors walked, your permits stalled, and you were bleeding cash. To prevent a total collapse and save your precious public ego, you went to Atlanta Independent Bank. But you did not just take out a standard commercial loan. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the glowing red numbers on the screen. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. You cross-collateralized your entire portfolio, I announced, ensuring every single syllable struck him with maximum impact. You took the deeds to every single property you own in the West End, every apartment complex, every retail strip, every piece of land you just bragged about owning, and you illegally bundled them together to secure one massive, high-risk, unpayable loan. You leveraged your entire empire on a single roll of the dice, hiding the true debt-to-income ratio from the bank through a labyrinth of shell companies managed by your idiot son-in-law, currently bleeding on the floor. Vivienne let out a piercing, horrified scream. She lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm, her nails digging desperately into his tailored suit. "Marcus, tell her she is lying." Vivienne shrieked, her voice frantic and breathless. "Tell them our money is safe. Tell them our properties are safe." Marcus could not speak. He could not look at his wife. He was staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of his total annihilation projected on the wall for all of his wealthy peers to witness. "Atlanta Independent Bank realized your debt was toxic 2 weeks ago." I continued, my voice cold and entirely devoid of mercy. "They recognized that your portfolio was a house of cards ready to collapse. They quietly classified your entire massive loan package as distressed debt. They bundled it up and put it on the private institutional market for pennies on the dollar, desperate to offload your radioactive liability before it tanked their quarterly earnings." I took one final devastating step closer to him, lowering my voice, so the absolute finality of my words would cut straight through to his core. Coincidentally, I whispered, staring directly into his terrified, broken eyes. "My brother Malik heads a private equity investment group out of San Francisco. And yesterday morning at exactly 9 a.m., his firm aggressively bought up the entire distressed debt portfolio of Atlanta Independent Bank. Every single loan, every single mortgage, every single deed you fraudulently cross-collateralized." The color vanished completely from Marcus Caldwell's face. He swayed on his feet, looking as though all the bones in his body had suddenly turned to ash. "You do not own the West End, Marcus," I stated, delivering the final fatal strike. "My family does. And because you explicitly lied on your federal loan origination forms regarding your actual liquid assets, you have officially triggered an automatic, non-negotiable covenant breach." The sheer magnitude of my statement hung suspended in the heavy air of the dining room. If you were to pull back and look at the scene from a distance, the visual was striking. The Caldwell family, once the undisputed royalty of Atlanta high society, was now entirely isolated. The surrounding diners, the waiters, the club managers, everyone had unconsciously taken a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from the epicenter of the fallout. The Caldwell table was an island of impending ruin in the middle of a crowded, opulent room. They were completely surrounded by their wealthy peers, yet they had never been more utterly alone. The glamorous facade had been stripped away, leaving only four desperate, terrified people drowning in the wreckage of their own greed. Marcus Sr. refused to accept the reality staring him in the face. His mind, conditioned by decades of absolute control and unchecked privilege, violently rejected the concept of defeat. He let out a low, guttural growl and reached into the breast pocket of his ruined suit, his thick fingers trembling wildly as he pulled out his phone. He furiously tapped the screen, dialing the private unlisted cell phone number of the regional director of Atlanta Independent Bank. This was the man he played golf with every single Sunday. The man he had bribed with luxury vacations, expensive dinners, and insider trading tips for the last 15 years. He pressed the phone hard against his ear. The silence in the room was so profound that I could easily hear the faint rhythmic ringing emanating from the receiver. Ring. 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 Marcus paced a tight, frantic circle behind his chair, his face turning an alarming mottled shade of crimson. "Answer the phone, Richard," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting toward the glowing digital screens displaying his financial execution. The call went straight to a generic voicemail. Marcus cursed loudly, stabbing the screen with his thumb to redial the number. Again the hollow ringing echoed from the tiny speaker. Again it went straight to the automated voicemail. The bank director was ghosting him. The reality of his toxic financial status had already circulated through the upper echelons of the Atlanta banking sector, and the rats were actively fleeing the sinking ship. His money could no longer buy their loyalty because his money no longer existed. Marcus hurled his expensive phone against the marble floor. The device shattered into a dozen pieces, sliding across the polished surface and hitting the polished shoes of a nearby waiter. He whirled around to face me, his chest heaving, his eyes bulging with a manic, cornered desperation. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face, trying to summon the terrifying patriarch persona that had kept me in line since childhood. "You are bluffing!" he roared, his voice cracking horribly under the immense strain of his rising panic. "You are playing a stupid, elaborate game with digital spreadsheets just to scare us. You cannot legally touch my properties. You cannot seize my commercial assets. I have teams of corporate lawyers who will tie this up in litigation for the next decade. You cannot just foreclose on my entire empire overnight." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I stood perfectly still, letting my calm, icy demeanor completely swallow his frantic, flailing rage. I allowed a cold, deliberate smile to touch my lips, relishing the absolute power I held over the man who had stolen my life for a paycheck. "I did not do it overnight, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing with the devastating clarity of absolute truth. "I am a forensic accountant. You thought I was just a massive disappointment, a mediocre number cruncher who lacked the pedigree and the basic intelligence to understand your brilliant business moves. You forced me to sit at the far end of this very table for years, treating me like a slow, unwanted employee. But while you were ignoring me, belittling me, and bragging loudly about your illegal acquisitions, I was working." I took a slow, measured step toward him, forcing him to hold his ground as his empire crumbled around his feet. "I spent 5 long, exhausting years meticulously untangling the massive, corrupt web of your shell companies." I explained, watching the blood drain completely from his face. 5 years of mapping every single fraudulent loan origination you ever signed. 5 years of tracing every dirty dollar you washed through your commercial developments in the West End. 5 years of building an airtight, mathematically perfect federal case against a man who orchestrated the kidnapping of an infant just to fund his very first real estate acquisition. I did not rush this process. I engineered your destruction with the calculated patience of a woman who has waited her entire life for justice. Malik stepped forward from the shadows, his expression carved from stone. He handed me a thick, heavy black leather folder. I took it and dropped it right onto the spilled red wine staining the tablecloth in front of Marcus. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded exactly like a coffin slamming shut. "The final foreclosure order, along with the immediate federal seizure of all your commercial and personal assets, was officially approved and signed by the Supreme Court at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon." I announced, my words striking him like physical concussive blows. "There will be no decade-long litigation. There will be no slick corporate lawyers rushing to save you because their retainer checks will bounce by tomorrow morning. The federal marshals are already at your corporate headquarters, changing the locks on the doors. Welcome to bankruptcy, Marcus." The fight instantly drained out of Marcus Sr. The aggressive, bullying titan of Atlanta real estate vanished into thin air, leaving behind a hollow, ruined shell of a man. He let out a breathless, wheezing gasp, his knees visibly buckling beneath his heavy frame. He crashed down hard into his dining chair, his hands violently shaking as they gripped the armrests. His jaw slacked, his eyes staring blindly at the black leather folder resting in the spilled wine. He was completely, irrevocably broken. Vivienne watched her husband collapse. She watched the source of her platinum credit cards, her designer wardrobe, and her undisputed social dominance evaporate into the ether. For a split second, her face was a mask of pure, unfiltered horror as she realized she was now officially penniless and facing federal kidnapping charges. But Vivienne Stokes Caldwell was a survivor of the most manipulative, narcissistic kind. She instantly realized that Marcus was completely useless to her now. She realized that Preston was going to federal prison. Her entire empire of stolen wealth was gone forever. So she immediately pivoted to her only remaining currency. She weaponized her reputation. Vivienne dramatically threw herself forward, falling to her knees right there on the wine-stained marble floor in front of Judge Montgomery. The tears began to flow instantly. They were thick, heavy, perfectly calculated crocodile tears streaming down her flawless, expensive makeup. She clasped her hands tightly together in front of her chest, looking up at my biological mother and me with wide, pleading, desperately innocent eyes. She began to wail, a loud, theatrical sound of pure manufactured agony designed to draw sympathy from the wealthy patrons recording the scene on their phones. "You cannot do this to me!" Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling with practiced weaponized vulnerability. I am a woman of God. I am the lead deaconess at Grace Cathedral. I run the largest Christian charity outreach program in all of Fulton County. My entire congregation relies on me. The poor abandoned orphans rely on me. You cannot destroy my life and my holy work over a simple misunderstanding from 25 years ago. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of Rosalind's judicial robe, but Tariq stepped cleanly in front of her, forcing her to shrink back, her hands hovering in the air. The church will not stand for this persecution, Vivian cried out, her voice echoing with righteous delusional indignation. My pastor will personally vouch for my impeccable moral character. I am a righteous, God-fearing woman who only ever tried to show you the absolute love of Christ, Nia. We clothed you. We fed you. We brought you to the Lord when you had absolutely nothing. You are letting the devil poison your heart against the very woman who saved your soul. Vivian's breathing was erratic, her chest heaving violently as she remained on her knees amid the shattered crystal and pooling red wine. The absolute chaos of her physical movements was a jarring, pathetic contrast to the pristine, intensely controlled image she had projected for decades. She looked utterly deranged, her hands fluttering wildly in the air, seeking a savior that was simply not coming. When the religious guilt failed to make me flinch, she immediately switched tactics, leaning heavily into cultural and social manipulation. Are you going to humiliate me in front of the whole parish? Vivian wailed, her voice cracking as she threw her arms wide, gesturing blindly to the surrounding audience. I am a pillar of this community. I taught you the word of God. I taught you how to navigate this world. I taught you to be a self-respecting Black woman when you were nothing but a lost, angry teenager with no future. We gave you the Caldwell name. We gave you status. You are spitting on the very hands that lifted you out of the dirt. She sobbed louder, shifting her weight on the cold marble floor, scanning the room to ensure her performance was being witnessed by the elite patrons of the Commerce Club. She wanted them to see the ungrateful, wicked adopted daughter destroying her saintly, benevolent mother. It was the exact same toxic narrative she had spun for years behind closed doors. But now she was broadcasting it live, desperate for public validation. You have no respect for family, Vivian cried out, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. You have no respect for the church. You are willing to tear down a legacy of faith and charity just to satisfy your own bitter jealousy. The Lord sees your wicked heart, Nia. He sees exactly what you are doing to the righteous people who took you in and gave you a life. I let her cry. I let the dramatic, ringing accusations hang in the stale, tense air of the dining room. I did not break my composure. I did not raise my voice in defense. I simply looked down at the woman who had spent 15 years making me feel completely worthless, and I felt nothing but profound clinical disgust. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out a weapon, but to Vivian it might as well have been a loaded gun. I withdrew a thick, worn, leather-bound notebook. It was not a digital file displayed on a screen. It was a physical ledger, painstakingly compiled, verified, and cross-referenced over hundreds of sleepless nights in my government office. I tossed the heavy leather book onto the center of the ruined table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack, sending a fresh spray of spilled wine across the white linen. Is your self-respect measured by embezzling from the church orphanage building fund to buy the ostrich Hermes Birkin you are currently holding, Vivian? I asked. My voice was not raised, but the absolute chilling clarity of my words cut through her hysterical sobbing like a surgical blade. Vivian froze instantly. The manufactured tears stopped flowing. The air caught painfully in her throat, producing a strangled, choking sound. Her eyes darted instinctively to the chair beside her, where her pristine caramel-colored ostrich skin handbag sat entirely untouched by the surrounding destruction. You love to play the saint, I continued, stepping around the debris to stand directly over her. You love to stand at the pulpit at Grace Cathedral, demanding tithes and offerings from working-class families who can barely afford their rent. You weep openly for the orphans. You pray loudly for the less fortunate. You collect millions of dollars in generous donations for the Grace Cathedral Youth Shelter Initiative, a shelter that has miraculously remained in the planning stages for 6 long years. Vivian scrambled backward on the floor, her hands slipping on the wet marble as she tried to put distance between us. "Those are internal church matters," she stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked, breathless whisper. "You have absolutely no right to look into sacred funds. That money is managed by the elders. It is protected." "That money is managed exclusively by you," I corrected sharply, leaning down to ensure she heard every single syllable. "As the lead deaconess and head of the Charity Outreach Committee, you have sole discretionary access to the shelter construction accounts. And you have been treating those accounts like your own personal piggy bank for half a decade." I pointed down at the leather notebook resting on the table. "That book contains the complete, unredacted transaction history of the Grace Cathedral Outreach Fund. It details exactly how you siphoned $2.4 million of charitable donations directly into a private offshore trust registered under your maiden name. You did not just steal, Vivienne. You stole from vulnerable people who trusted you with their salvation. You stole from children who genuinely needed a roof over their heads." Lies, Vivienne hissed, her face contorting with a sudden vicious ugliness. The benevolent church lady vanished, entirely replaced by a cornered, desperate predator. "You fabricated those records to destroy my impeccable reputation. I have audits. I have certified accountants who verify every single penny that comes in and out of that ministry. Your accountants are the exact same fraudulent firm your husband uses to cook his real estate books." "Books," I countered, shutting down her defense instantly. "But my audit is federal, and my audit traces the serial numbers of the specific funds transferred out of the church accounts directly to the luxury boutiques in Paris, Milan, and New York. Do you want me to read the receipts aloud to the entire dining room?" I did not wait for her permission. I recited the raw data from memory, the numbers burned into my brain after months of grueling investigation. "October 4th, 2 years ago." I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the utterly silent restaurant. "A wire transfer of $45,000 from the Grace Cathedral Orphanage Fund was explicitly flagged as a building materials expenditure. That exact amount cleared your personal offshore account 3 days later and was immediately wired to a private broker in Paris for the purchase of the limited edition ostrich skin bag sitting on that chair." Vivienne's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like she was physically suffocating under the weight of her exposed sins. "December 12th, I continued relentlessly. $75,000 flagged as winter outreach supplies was diverted to pay for your exclusive facial reconstruction surgeries at a private clinic in Switzerland. Last April, $120,000 meant for the community food bank paid for your lavish month-long luxury cruise through the Mediterranean. You literally ate the food out of starving children's mouths so you could drink vintage champagne on a private yacht." "Stop it," Vivienne pleaded, her voice reduced to a pathetic, ragged croak. She was no longer performing for the crowd. The sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes was finally genuine. "Please, Nia, please stop. You dared to lecture me about being a self-respecting Black woman," I said, my tone dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "There is no respect in stealing from your own community. There is no dignity in using the word of God as a convenient shield for your insatiable, bottomless greed. You are a parasite, Vivienne. You built your entire social kingdom by draining the life out of the very people you swore to protect. And tonight, your entire congregation is going to see exactly who you really are." I looked down at her ruined designer dress, her stained knees, and her completely shattered composure. The woman who had terrorized my youth, who had constantly reminded me of my unworthiness, was now a pathetic, trembling mess on the floor. "The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division received the complete unredacted ledger this morning," I informed her, delivering the final crushing blow. "They have already frozen your offshore accounts. They have formally seized your luxury assets. The federal indictment for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion is currently being processed by the district attorney. You are not going back to your sprawling mansion tonight, Vivienne. You are going straight to federal lockup." Vivienne slumped forward, her forehead pressing heavily against the cold marble floor. A low, keening sound of pure, inescapable despair escaped her trembling lips. Her carefully constructed universe of charity galas, front-row church pews, and unquestioned moral superiority had completely disintegrated into dust. The oppressive silence in the Commerce Club was absolute. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The sheer magnitude of the Caldwell family's total annihilation had paralyzed the entire room. I stood victorious amidst the wreckage, flanked by Malik and Tariq, having successfully executed the flawless dismantling of a corrupt empire. But the evening was not quite finished. From the far corner of the dining room, at a secluded, dimly lit VIP table reserved for the city's most influential spiritual leaders, a figure abruptly pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly and aggressively across the floor, breaking the eerie silence. I watched as Reverend Dr. Ezekiel Vance, the senior pastor of Grace Cathedral, and the man Vivian had just invoked as her ultimate character witness, stood up. He was a tall, incredibly imposing man with a booming presence, but right now his face was flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He had been dining quietly with several influential city council members, and he had heard every single word of my presentation. Reverend Vance did not look at the politicians sitting at his table. He did not look at the waiters or the stunned patrons. His burning, furious gaze was locked entirely on Vivian Caldwell's trembling form on the floor. He gripped the edge of his table for a brief moment, his knuckles turning white, before he began to march directly toward us, his heavy footsteps echoing with the terrifying promise of divine retribution. Reverend Dr. Ezekiel Vance stopped precisely at the edge of the shattered porcelain, and pooling red wine, his heavy polished dress shoes planting firmly against the marble floor. He was a man of immense physical stature, carrying the profound, heavy gravity of a spiritual leader who commanded a congregation of over 10,000 people. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles ticked visibly beneath his dark skin, and his eyes burned with a righteous, devastating fury. He completely bypassed the catatonic, sweating form of Marcus Sr. He did not spare a single glance for Preston, who was still weeping pathetic, wine-soaked tears into the ruined tablecloth. And most tellingly, he completely ignored the hysterical, groveling woman kneeling on the floor right in front of him. I locked eyes with the Reverend. The visual framing of the moment was incredibly stark. It was just the two of us existing in an elevated plane of absolute, uncompromising accountability, completely bypassing the frantic, writhing woman on the floor between us. I did not look down at Vivian. Reverend Vance did not look down at Vivian. We held a rigid, silent two-shot, an unspoken electric acknowledgement between a man who shepherded a vulnerable community and the woman who had just dragged the blood-soaked wolf out into the harsh light of day. Vivienne instantly sensed the terrifying dynamic. She realized with mounting horror that the powerful man of God she had spent a decade manipulating was not looking at her with pity or pastoral concern. He was looking at me for the unvarnished truth. Panic, raw and absolute, finally broke through Vivienne's heavily curated facade. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp edges of broken crystal cutting into her expensive designer tights. She clawed desperately at the thick wooden legs of the dining table, trying to pull herself up into our shared line of sight, aggressively forcing herself into the space between us. Ezekiel, please, she babbled, her voice shrill and entirely breathless, dropping his formal title in her absolute blind terror. You know my heart. You know my unwavering devotion to Grace Cathedral. This is a massive, horrific misunderstanding. You cannot possibly listen to the venomous lies of a deeply disturbed, ungrateful child. Reverend Vance did not blink. He kept his dark, furious eyes locked squarely on mine, his silence serving as a suffocating weight pressing down on Vivian's chest. It is an accounting error! Vivian practically screamed, her hands fluttering wildly in the air as she desperately tried to weave a safety net out of thin air. It is a simple, secular administrative mistake. You know how utterly incompetent the volunteer bookkeeping staff can be, Pastor. Janice from accounting has been misfiling the ledger codes for months. The orphanage funds are perfectly safe. They were simply parked in an overseas holding account to accrue a higher yield of interest for the youth shelter project. I was trying to grow the church's money, Ezekiel. I was protecting the congregation's investments. It is a complex international tax mix-up, nothing more. You cannot let this bitter, jealous orphan poison your mind against your most faithful, devoted servant. I did not flinch. I did not shift my gaze from the Reverend's face to address the pathetic, frantic lies spilling from the floor beneath me. Instead, I reached smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer for the second time that evening. I extracted a sleek matte black metallic card. It was thick, heavy, and engraved with a single complex QR code alongside a 24-character alphanumeric sequence. I placed the metal card gently on the only dry corner of the ruined tablecloth and slid it precisely across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Reverend Vance. That is a direct encrypted access credential to a secure federal cloud drive. I stated my voice completely level, slicing effortlessly through Vivian's shrill, hysterical whining with surgical, undeniable precision. You do not need to take my word for anything, Reverend. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to look at the math. Reverend Vance slowly lowered his gaze to the black metal card, his chest rising and falling with heavy, controlled breaths. That cloud drive contains thousands of pages of irrefutable bank-certified documentation. I continued, my tone entirely clinical and devoid of emotion. It contains the exact unredacted wire transfer receipts from the Grace Cathedral operational accounts. Every single transfer was authorized and signed exclusively by Vivian Stokes Caldwell. There was no volunteer involvement. There was no administrative error from a woman named Janice. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her throat as if she were physically choking on her own exposure. More importantly, I said, maintaining my unbroken eye contact with the towering clergyman, it contains the routing numbers, the deposit slips, and the monthly statements for a highly shielded private wealth account at Cayman National Bank in Grand Cayman. An account registered under an untraceable shell corporation named VSC Holdings. Vivian Stokes Caldwell. The funds did not sit in a holding account to accrue interest for a youth shelter reverend. They were systematically drained to purchase a sprawling luxury villa in Monaco. They paid for private chartered jets to Paris. They financed the very diamonds she wears to Sunday service, bought with the pennies donated by the widows and working-class families of your congregation. The utter silence that followed was apocalyptic. Reverend Vance stared at the black access card resting on the table. He did not need to log in right that second to know it was true. He could feel the devastating reality of it in the air. He could see the undeniable guilt radiating from the trembling, ruined woman weeping at his feet. The magnitude of the betrayal, the sheer staggering scale of the theft from his sacred institution, settled over his broad shoulders like a physical weight. When Reverend Vance finally spoke, his voice was no longer the booming, charismatic instrument he used to command his megachurch. It was a low, terrifying rumble vibrating with the chilling authority of divine judgment. For 10 years you have stood at my altar, Vivian the Reverend said, his voice dripping with absolute profound revulsion. You have stood before my congregation holding the hands of the poor, weeping for the less fortunate and demanding tithes from people who could barely afford to feed their own children. You used the Lord's house to line your own pockets. You used the faith of vulnerable people as a shield for your own insatiable greed. You are a wolf in sheep's clothing, and your feast ends tonight. Vivian threw herself completely flat on the floor, grabbing desperately at the cuffs of his trousers. Ezekiel, why beg of you, she wailed, her voice cracking into a hideous guttural screech. Think of the scandal, think of the media. The church cannot survive a public relations nightmare of this magnitude. Let me fix it quietly. Let me replace the money. If you expose me, you destroy the reputation of Grace Cathedral. Reverend Vance roughly pulled his leg back, stepping entirely out of her desperate reach, as if her very touch was toxic. The reputation of Grace Cathedral is built on truth, not the protection of thieves, Vance proclaimed, his voice echoing with absolute finality. As of this exact second, you are permanently stripped of your title as lead deaconess. You are immediately removed from the Charity Outreach Board. You are no longer a member of my congregation, and you are explicitly banned from setting foot on church property ever again. He reached down, his large hand closing firmly over the black metal access card. He slipped it securely into the pocket of his suit jacket, and finally looked directly down at Vivian's ruined, tear-streaked face. I am not going to protect you, Vivian the Reverend stated, his eyes burning with cold, unforgiving justice. I am going to walk back to my table, and I am going to personally dial the chief of police and the federal authorities. I will hand them this access code myself, and I will ensure that Grace Cathedral cooperates fully and completely with your federal prosecution. May God have mercy on your soul, because the law certainly will not." Without another word, Reverend Vance turned his back on the Caldwell family and marched purposefully away from the wreckage, heading straight toward the exit of the dining room to make the call that would officially end Vivian's freedom. Vivian collapsed entirely, her body curling into a tight, trembling fetal position on the cold marble floor. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a long, hollow wail of absolute total defeat. She was socially dead. She was spiritually exiled, and by tomorrow morning she would be a federal inmate. Beside her, Marcus remained frozen in his chair, a catatonic, sweating monument to a bankrupted empire. Preston was still curled up near the serving cart, whining softly, entirely paralyzed by his impending criminal charges. The three pillars of the Caldwell dynasty had been systematically, flawlessly obliterated in less than 20 minutes. And then there was Chloe. Chloe Caldwell stood at the edge of the shattered table, completely untouched by the spilled wine or the broken porcelain. Her perfect, heavily curated world had just disintegrated before her eyes. She had watched her husband exposed as a cheating, thieving fraud. She had watched her invincible father financially ruined and stripped of his beloved real estate empire. She had just watched her untouchable, socially dominant mother get excommunicated and handed over to federal prosecutors by her own pastor. Chloe looked at the pathetic, broken forms of the people she had worshipped her entire life. She realized with a sudden, suffocating clarity that the bank accounts were frozen. The credit cards were dead. The penthouses, the PR firm, the cars, and the social status were all gone forever. She had absolutely nothing left, and she had absolutely no one to protect her. Her frantic, terrified eyes darted away from the wreckage of her family and locked onto me. I was standing tall, flanked by two immensely powerful brothers, holding the absolute authority of the federal government in my hands. I was the only person in the room who possessed any remaining power. The transition was instantaneous and deeply sickening. The haughty, venomous hatred that had contorted Chloe's flawless face just minutes ago completely vanished. The aggressive classist sneer melted away, replaced instantly by a wide-eyed, trembling mask of desperate, cloying affection. She took a shaky, hesitant step toward me, her hands reaching out in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "Nia," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with a manufactured, desperate sweetness, tears welling up in her eyes as she attempted to deploy the ultimate manipulative weapon. "Nia, please, you cannot let them do this. You have to stop this. Please look at me. We grew up together. We shared a home. Regardless of what has happened tonight, you are my sister." The sheer psychological whiplash of Chloe's sudden transformation was grotesque to witness. She did not merely step toward me. She completely collapsed, dropping heavily to her knees, right in the center of the ruined dining room. Her $1,000 silk gown sank directly into the puddle of spilled red wine and shattered porcelain, soaking up the dark liquid like a sponge. But she did not even seem to notice the physical discomfort. The entire room seemed to tilt on its axis, the geometry of the opulent space warping around her twisted, desperate performance. She was looking up at me from the floor, her hands clasped together in a perfect picture of manufactured theatrical agony. "I had no idea Preston was doing those disgusting things," Chloe sobbed, her voice ringing out loudly, ensuring every single wealthy patron in the Commerce Club could hear her playing the victim. She threw the husband she had sworn to love and cherish completely under the bus without a fraction of a second of hesitation. "He lied to me, Nia. He used my public relations firm without my knowledge. He manipulated me. And Mom and Dad, I swear to you, I did not know about Dad's fraudulent loans or Mom's church accounts. I am completely innocent in all of this. They kept me in the dark. They used me just like they used you." She reached out, her manicured fingers trembling violently as she tried to grasp the hem of my skirt. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, pulling myself entirely out of her reach. Tariq shifted his massive frame slightly forward, a silent, menacing warning that made Chloe flinch, but her desperation to save her own skin completely overrode her fear. "You can take the real estate empire." Chloe babbled, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, hysterical rush. "You can take Dad's commercial properties. You can send Preston to federal prison for the rest of his miserable life. I genuinely do not care. He deserves it for betraying me. Just please, Nia, please do not let the bank take my home. My beautiful house in Buckhead. It is my sanctuary. It is all I have left in the world. You have to tell Malik to exempt my property from the foreclosure. We are family. We grew up under the exact same roof. You have to have mercy on your big sister. The absolute silence in the restaurant was deafening. The elite diners, the politicians, and the socialites who had previously worshipped at the altar of the Caldwell dynasty were now watching the golden child beg for scraps on the floor, like a cornered rat fleeing a sinking ship. She was entirely willing to watch her parents face federal indictment and her husband rot in a cell as long as she got to keep her custom marble countertops and her walk-in closets. I looked down at her tear-streaked face. For a fleeting second, my mind flashed back 10 years. I remembered being an 18-year-old girl standing in the foyer of the Caldwell mansion, begging for the absolute bare minimum of human decency and receiving nothing but cold, mocking laughter from the very woman currently sobbing at my feet. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us until my face was only inches from hers. The air around us seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "You did not know?" I asked, my voice dropping into a register so cold and devoid of empathy that it made the hairs on the back of Chloe's neck stand up. "You want to kneel there in your ruined silk dress and play the innocent, naive victim who was completely blind to the corruption in her own family. You want to invoke the sacred bond of sisterhood to save your precious real estate. Let us talk about what sisters do to each other, Chloe. Let us talk about what you knew." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. The manufactured tears stopped flowing, replaced by a sudden, very real shadow of panic creeping into her wide eyes. "Do you remember the summer I turned 18? I asked, keeping my gaze locked onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "Do you remember the private academic scholarship I won, the full-ride university grant that was my only ticket out of this toxic, suffocating family? The money was routed to a joint familial educational trust account because I was still legally a dependent under Marcus's guardianship for 3 more months." Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously from left to right as the devastating truth of her past began to close in around her. "That same summer, Marcus temporarily cut off your platinum credit cards because you had crashed your 3rd imported sports car." I continued, my voice slicing through her panic with mathematical precision. "You were furious. You had a 6-week luxury vacation through Europe planned with your sorority sisters, and suddenly you had no way to pay for your first-class flights or your 5-star hotel suites in Rome. You threw a massive tantrum, but Marcus refused to budge, so you decided to find your own funding." I slowly stood up straight, looking down at her trembling form with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You did not know anything about fraud?" "Chloe," I asked loudly, my voice carrying to the very back of the dining room. "Then please tell me who forged my signature on July 14th of that year. Who walked into the bank, presented themselves as an authorized signatory on the Joint Educational Trust, and submitted a fraudulent withdrawal slip?" Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head frantically side to side. "No," she whimpered, her voice barely a breath. "Dad said he would replace it. He said he would put the money back before the fall semester started. He never put a single dime back." I stated the harsh reality of that betrayal still burning in my chest after a decade. "You completely liquidated $60,000 meant to secure my entire future. You drained my academic lifeline down to zero, leaving me entirely destitute and forcing me to drop out of my first semester of college. You threw me out onto the street, forcing me to work 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford a moldy studio apartment and night classes while you were drinking Bellinis on the Amalfi Coast and posting photos of your designer shopping bags on social media." I reached into the same pocket where I had kept the church ledger and pulled out a single heavily laminated piece of paper. I dropped it so it fluttered down and landed directly in Chloe's lap. "I am a forensic accountant, Chloe," I reminded her, watching her stare in horror at the laminated document. "When I spent 5 years systematically dismantling Dad's fraudulent empire." I did not just look at the recent commercial loans. I dug into the deep archives. I found the original withdrawal slip buried in the legacy files at Atlanta Independent Bank. I pulled the microfilm. Your handwriting is distinctively arrogant, sister. You did not even try to mask your looping, exaggerated signature when you forged my name. I had the document verified by two independent federal handwriting experts before I ever stepped foot in this city tonight. Chloe stared down at the withdrawal slip sitting in her lap, the undeniable proof of her oldest and ugliest sin staring right back at her. She had stolen a teenager's future to fund a summer vacation, and she had never lost a single second of sleep over it. Her entire identity, her entire claim to moral superiority was a complete and utter fabrication. "You robbed me," I declared, stepping over the edge of the ruined tablecloth to stand directly above her. "You committed federal bank fraud and identity theft to finance a European holiday. And now you have the absolute audacity to kneel in front of me and beg for your mansion." Chloe looked up, her face entirely devoid of color, her jaw trembling so violently, her teeth chattered together. She realized that the sisterly bond she was trying to exploit did not exist because she had murdered it herself 10 years ago. "Please, Nia." Chloe gasped, her pride entirely broken, her vanity stripped away to reveal the terrified hollow shell beneath. "I will do anything. I will pay you back the $60,000. I will sell my jewelry. Just leave me the house. It is in my name. You cannot take my home for something I did when I was young and stupid." I tilted my head, studying her with a look of profound, chilling amusement. The corners of my mouth curled upward in a predatory smile that made Malik chuckle softly from the shadows. "You really are exactly like your father, Chloe," I said smoothly. "You enjoy the illusion of wealth without ever bothering to understand how the mechanics of wealth actually operate. You think that because you picked out the custom mahogany front doors and selected the imported Italian marble for the kitchen island, the house actually belongs to you. You think your name on the mailbox means you hold the deed." Chloe's brow furrowed in desperate confusion. "It is my house," she insisted weakly. "Preston bought it for me for our first anniversary." "Preston bought absolutely nothing," I corrected her, my voice turning to ice. "Preston used his position to secure a massive corporate loan. Your gorgeous $10 million estate in Buckhead is not registered to Chloe Caldwell or Preston Vance. It is legally registered to a subsidiary holding company named Peachtree Luxury Developments, a company that is 100% owned by your father, Marcus Caldwell." Chloe's eyes widened to the size of saucers as the devastating reality of her financial situation finally penetrated her panic. When Marcus fraudulently cross-collateralized his entire portfolio to save his Midtown commercial project, he did not just pledge his office buildings, I explained, driving the final lethal nail into the coffin of her opulent lifestyle. He pledged every single asset owned by his holding companies. He pledged the very roof over your head. Your perfect magazine-ready mansion is officially classified as toxic collateral. It was bundled into the exact same distressed debt portfolio that my brother Malik purchased yesterday morning. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless shriek, her hands flying to her mouth as she looked wildly toward her father, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, completely unable to deny a single word I was saying. "You do not own a mansion, Chloe," I stated, delivering the most ruthless declaration of the entire evening. "You are currently trespassing in a property that is legally owned by my brother's private equity firm. And because your father has officially defaulted on the covenants of that loan, the foreclosure process does not take months, it takes hours." I stepped back, signaling to Malik and Tariq that our business at the table was finally concluded. I looked down at the sobbing, ruined socialite on the floor one last time. "At exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," I announced, ensuring my voice carried the absolute unyielding weight of the law, "federal marshals and property liquidators will be arriving at your estate in Buckhead. They will be changing the gate codes. They will be placing padlocks on those custom mahogany front doors. You have less than 12 hours to pack whatever clothes you can fit into the trunk of your car and get off my property." Chloe did not scream. She did not argue. The sheer brutal finality of my words stripped the air right out of her lungs, leaving her gasping like a fish thrown onto dry land. She collapsed backward onto the floor, her hands gripping her perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive extensions as she rocked back and forth. The Buckhead mansion was her entire identity. It was the venue for her society parties, the backdrop for her carefully curated social media existence, the physical proof that she was better than everyone else. Without it, she was nobody. She was just another bankrupt fraud sitting in a puddle of spilled wine. She turned her frantic, tear-streaked face upward, looking for the one man who had always fixed her problems, who had always shielded her from the consequences of her own horrific behavior. Daddy, she choked out her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Daddy, tell her she cannot do this. Tell her to give it back. Marcus Sr. had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock since the federal foreclosure documents had landed on the table. But the sound of his biological daughter's pathetic begging, combined with the absolute public humiliation of his legacy being dismantled by the very girl he had treated like a servant, finally snapped something deep inside his brain. The towering narcissistic ego that had fueled his entire life violently rejected the reality of his defeat. He kicked his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor behind him. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his soaked collar. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest, completely ignoring his weeping daughter on the floor. $60,000! Marcus roared, his voice echoing through the silent dining room, raw and unhinged. You are destroying your own sister. You are tearing down this entire family over a measly $60,000. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me, just as he had done when I was a terrified child living under his roof. You think you earned that money, he bellowed, spit flying from his lips in his blind rage. You think that scholarship belonged to you? You owed us that money. We took you in when you were nothing. We housed you in a mansion in the best zip code in Atlanta. We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you the Caldwell name to hide the fact that you were just a stray pulled out of the gutter. Do you have any idea how much money it cost to raise you for 25 years? That $60,000 does not even begin to cover the debt you owe me for keeping a roof over your ungrateful head. You owe me everything you have. I was actually breathing heavily, his chest heaving, as he stood there completely convinced of his own righteous victimhood. He genuinely believed that stealing my future, forcing me to drop out of college and throwing me onto the street was a justified collection of a debt. It was the ultimate sickening display of his sociopathic arrogance. But I did not have to answer him. The focal point of the entire room seemed to shift, drawing inward with agonizing cinematic slowness, centering entirely on Judge Rosalind Montgomery as she stepped forward from the shadows. The air around her crackled with an absolute terrifying authority. She did not look like a grieving mother in that moment. She looked exactly like what she was, a sitting federal judge who was about to deliver a lethal, inescapable sentence. You did not raise my daughter with your money, Marcus Rosalind stated. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, vibrating resonance that cut through his screaming rage and silenced him instantly. You did not spend a single solitary dime of your own wealth keeping a roof over her head. Marcus blinked, his blustering momentum momentarily derailed by the sheer icy conviction in her eyes. What are you talking about? He stammered, his bravado slipping. I paid for everything. I built this family. Rosalind reached into the thick leather briefcase Malik was holding beside her. She withdrew a massive, heavy stack of bound financial records. They were stamped with the official embossed seals of one of the largest trust management banks in the country. She did not toss them. She slammed them down onto the marble floor right at Marcus's feet, the heavy thud echoing like a gunshot. Nia's biological father. David was a highly successful corporate litigator before he passed away. Rosalind declared every word, striking Marcus like a physical blow. He knew he was sick. He knew his time was limited. And before he died, he liquidated his private equity shares and established an ironclad, irrevocable trust fund solely for the care, education, and protection of his only daughter. I stopped breathing. The entire room seemed to dissolve around me, the faces of the wealthy patrons fading into the background. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. A trust fund. My biological father had left me a trust fund. He left her $15 million, Rosalind announced, the number hanging in the dead silence of the restaurant like a guillotine. Chloe let out a strangled gasp from the floor. Vivian, who had been curled in a fetal position, slowly raised her head, her face a mask of pure exposed terror. When you orchestrated the kidnapping of my infant daughter, You did not do it just to give your barren wife a child to parade around at church. Rosalind continued, stepping closer to Marcus, forcing him to shrink back under her blazing maternal fury. You did your research. You targeted a grieving, isolated widow because you knew about the money. You claimed legal guardianship under fraudulent pretenses explicitly to gain administrative control over a $15 million trust. Marcus was shaking now, his hands trembling wildly as he stared down at the bank records at his feet. The veins in his forehead throbbed as his darkest, most closely guarded secret was dragged out into the light. You created a fake shell guardianship corporation called Caldwell Child Services. Rosalind explained, her voice dripping with absolute lethal precision. You used that fake entity to bill the trust for exorbitant, entirely fabricated childcare expenses. But you did not stop there. Once you gained full administrative access, you completely drained the principal. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at his chest. That massive flagship commercial plaza in Midtown that launched your entire real estate empire. It was purchased using a $2 million wire transfer directly from my daughter's trust fund. The luxury vehicles your biological daughter crashed, the designer wardrobes, your wife flaunts the campaign contributions that bought you political immunity, all of it was paid for by siphoning every last penny from the money David left to protect his little girl. Tears burned the back of my eyes, but they were tears of absolute blinding rage. For my entire life I had been treated like a parasite. I had been made to eat their leftovers, wear Chloe's discarded clothes, and clean their massive house to earn my keep. They had constantly, relentlessly reminded me that I was a financial burden, a charity case they had graciously rescued from poverty. But I had never been a burden. I had been their bank. My stolen inheritance had built the very walls they used to imprison me. They had forced me to drop out of college and live in a moldy, roach-infested apartment while they used my $15 million to play royalty in Atlanta high society. The sheer unfathomable evil of it was staggering. Yao built this entire upper-class facade on the back of a stolen child. Rosalind said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the entire room. You enslaved her, abused her, and convinced her she was worthless, all while living like a king on the fortune that rightfully belonged to her. You are not a self-made titan of industry, Marcus. You are a common, pathetic thief. And the federal grand jury has already received the complete paper trail. Marcus staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of a fallen chair. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to summon one last lie, one last aggressive defense, but there was nothing left. The bank records were right there on the floor. The dates, the signatures, the wire transfers. His entire life was a monumental criminal fraud. He let out a strange, wheezing sound, clutching his chest, as he sank heavily onto the floor beside his weeping daughter, his eyes blank, his mind entirely broken by the absolute certainty of his impending imprisonment. The Caldwell family was completely, utterly annihilated. They were all on the floor, surrounded by the physical debris of their ruined dinner and the legal debris of their ruined lives. But slightly outside the immediate circle of destruction, standing near the ornate brass serving cart, Preston Vance was having a completely different kind of breakdown. Preston had married Chloe Caldwell for one reason and one reason only: power. He was a slick, ambitious junior executive who believed he was marrying into a bulletproof real estate dynasty. He had willingly participated in Marcus's shady deals. He had proudly signed his name to the corporate loan that purchased his sprawling Buckhead mansion. He thought he was playing the game of high society finance with the big boys. But as Rosalind laid out the mechanics of the $15 million trust fund theft, the blood completely drained from Preston's perfectly tanned face. He was not a legal genius, but he knew enough about federal financial law to understand exactly what had just happened. The mansion he lived in was collateralized by stolen trust funds. The seed money for his own recent venture capital firm had been funneled through Marcus's shell companies. He was entirely, inextricably woven into a massive $15 million federal wire fraud and kidnapping conspiracy. When the FBI and the IRS tore through Marcus's books tomorrow morning, they were going to find Preston's signature on dozens of fraudulent documents. He was not just going to lose his house and his wealthy lifestyle. He was going to federal prison for a very, very long time. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized him. He looked at his wife Chloe weeping pathetically on the floor, her makeup running down her face. He looked at Marcus gasping for breath, his empire gone. He looked at Vivian rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. They were dead weight. They could not save him. They could not even save themselves. Preston began to back away slowly, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the wet marble. He needed a lifeline. He needed someone with enough money, enough power, and enough ruthless legal connections to shield him from the catastrophic fallout of the Caldwell family's destruction. His trembling hands patted his tailored trousers until he felt the hard outline of his smartphone. He pulled it out, his fingers shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He completely ignored the ruined family he had married into. He didn't spare a single glance for his weeping wife. He turned his back on the carnage, retreating into the shadowy alcove near the kitchen doors, out of the direct line of sight. He furiously tapped the screen, unlocking the phone and scrolling frantically through his contacts. He bypassed his own parents. He bypassed his junior partners. He scrolled until he found the one name that represented his absolute last hope for survival. He pressed the call button, holding the phone tightly against his ear, his breathing ragged and shallow as he listened to the line ring. He was calling his Uncle Arthur, a senior managing partner at one of the most aggressive, ruthless investment banks on Wall Street. A man who specialized in burying financial scandals and making federal indictments magically disappear. "Pick up," Preston muttered under his breath, his eyes darting back toward the dining room where Rosalind, Malik, Tariq, and I stood over the ashes of his life. "Come on, Arthur. Pick up the phone. I need an extraction." Preston Vance backed himself into the narrow, dimly lit alcove separating the main dining room from the kitchen corridors, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble. If you were tracking his movements through a lens, keeping the focus tight on his sweating, contorted face, you would see a man whose entire reality was violently imploding. The camera of my mind circled him, capturing every frantic dart of his eyes, every tremor in his hands, trapping him in a suffocating visual cage of his own making. The walls of the opulent Commerce Club seemed to physically bow inward, pressing the oxygen out of the space as he paced like a cornered rabid animal. He pressed his smartphone so against his ear that his knuckles turned completely white, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as he listened to the agonizing hollow tone of the ringing line. "Pick up the phone!" Arthur Preston muttered, his voice a frantic wet hiss. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, smearing his expensive cologne across his skin. "Pick up the damn phone!" The line clicked. A sharp, impatient voice barked a greeting on the other end. "Arthur, thank God!" Preston gasped, his voice cracking horribly. "It is Preston! Uncle Arthur, you have to help me! It is a complete disaster down here. Marcus is finished. They have federal warrants. They have the Cayman routing numbers. They have everything." Preston paused, his chest heaving as he listened to the sharp, annoyed response from his uncle. His polished, progressive, high society facade instantly dissolved, revealing the ugly, deeply entrenched bigotry that had always lurked just beneath his designer suits. Fear stripped away his manners, leaving only toxic, unfiltered entitlement. "You have to get me out of this!" Preston demanded, his voice rising in volume, entirely abandoning his previous attempt at discretion. "You have to use your connections at the Justice Department. Call the regional director. Call the governor. Call whoever you pay off to handle these things. You have to save me from these black people, Arthur. They are completely out of control. They are framing me. That ungrateful adopted rogue accountant and her thug brother are trying to pin Marcus's entire fraudulent empire on me. They fabricated documents. They hacked the trust funds. They are setting me up to take the fall for everything." Preston paced a tight, erratic circle in the alcove, his breathing increasingly shallow, completely unaware that he had drifted back toward the edge of the main dining room. His voice echoed clearly over the stunned silence of the remaining patrons. "They are just angry, bitter thugs playing dress-up in a nice restaurant." Preston spat into the receiver, his face twisting with a hideous, desperate sneer. "You know how these people are, Arthur. They get a little bit of authority, and they want to tear down the people who actually built this country. You need to send the firm's heavyweight fixers down here immediately. I want them buried in litigation. I want them destroyed." He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, taking a deep, shuddering breath, believing his frantic plea had landed. He believed that the legendary Sterling family power, the old Wall Street money that had shielded his uncle from decades of corporate malfeasance, would magically descend from New York and obliterate me. He turned around, stepping fully out of the shadows, his chest puffed out in a pathetic manufactured display of alpha male dominance. Preston looked directly at me, his lip curling into a snarl. The terror in his eyes was still palpable, but it was temporarily masked by the arrogant delusion of his bloodline. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Nia Preston sneered, his voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire room once again. "You think because you dug up some outdated bank slips and bullied a corrupt pastor that you have actually won? You have absolutely no idea what you have just walked into. You are playing a dangerous, stupid game in a league you do not even begin to understand." He took a step toward me, gesturing with his phone as if it were a weapon. "You think a federal audit scares my family?" Preston laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of any real humor. "I am a Sterling by blood. We invented the financial systems you are trying to use against me. My Uncle Arthur has United States senators on his speed dial. He has federal judges attending his summer barbecues in the Hamptons. We squash rogue, insignificant little government employees like you before breakfast. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and extortion. My family is going to crush you into dust." I did not move. I did not flinch. I just looked at him with the same clinical, absolute disgust I had reserved for Vivienne. I did not need to speak because I was not the one who was going to handle Preston Vance. From my right, Tariq stepped forward. My older brother moved with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. He did not rush. He did not display any anger. He simply closed the physical distance between himself and Preston in 3 long, perfectly measured strides. Tariq was a decorated supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man who hunted domestic terrorists and organized crime syndicates for a living. Preston, by contrast, was a soft, pampered coward who paid country club dues to feel powerful. Preston barely had time to register Tariq's movement before it was over. Tariq's large, incredibly strong hand shot out, moving faster than the eye could track. He clamped his fingers around Preston's wrist in a vice grip, twisting the joint just enough to send a blinding flare of pain shooting up Preston's arm. Preston let out a high, sharp yelp of agony, his fingers involuntarily opening. Tariq smoothly snatched the smartphone out of Preston's hand before it could hit the floor. He did not break eye contact with the trembling, terrified executive as he tapped the glowing speaker icon on the screen. Tariq held the phone up, positioning the microphone perfectly, so the voice on the other end would project clearly across the dead silence of the ruined dining room. Arthur Preston gasped, clutching his bruised wrist against his chest, his eyes darting frantically between Tariq's stoic face and the phone. Tell them who you are. Tell them what you are going to do to them." For a brief, agonizing second, there was only the faint hiss of static emanating from the tiny speaker. And then the cold, gravelly, unmistakably patrician voice of Arthur Sterling echoed through the Commerce Club. Preston Arthur said, his tone entirely flat, devoid of any familial warmth, possessing only the ruthless, calculated detachment of a man protecting his own survival. "Shut your mouth and listen to me very carefully." Preston froze his breath, catching in his throat at the strange, distant tone of his uncle's voice. "I am not calling the governor," Arthur continued, his words striking Preston with physical force. "I am not calling my fixers. And I am certainly not sending the firm's legal team to save you from your own staggering, monumental stupidity. I explicitly warned you 3 years ago not to get into bed with Marcus Caldwell. I told you his books were a toxic, leveraged nightmare. You thought you were smarter than everyone else. You thought you could ride his coattails to a quick fortune without getting your hands dirty." "Uncle Arthur, I do not understand." Preston whimpered, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. "You have to help me. I am your nephew." "You are a massive liability," Arthur corrected sharply, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "The moment I got wind of the federal subpoenas dropping in Atlanta this afternoon, I ordered a full internal audit of your division. I saw exactly what you did, Preston. I saw the corporate funds you illegally diverted to prop up Caldwell's failing commercial ventures. I saw the fraudulent loan applications you pushed through my bank to finance that ridiculous mansion in Buckhead. You exposed my firm to federal conspiracy charges. The air in the room grew heavy. Preston's knees began to buckle, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking completely hollow. But they are framing me. Preston tried one last desperate lie, his voice cracking into a sob. I did not know the money was stolen. Save your pathetic lies for the prosecutor, Arthur snapped. I do not care what those people in Atlanta are doing to you. I only care about protecting my firm and my name. That is why I personally called the regional director of the FBI an hour ago. Preston stopped breathing. The world completely stopped spinning. I handed them everything, Preston Arthur announced, delivering the lethal, inescapable kill shot. I gave the federal investigators complete unredacted access to your entire digital footprint. Every email, every hidden ledger, every illegal wire transfer you executed on behalf of the Caldwell family. I handed over the evidence of your embezzlement on a silver platter in exchange for a full corporate immunity deal for my firm. I cut you loose to save myself. You are entirely on your own, nephew. Do not ever call this number again. The line went dead with a sharp electronic click. The dial tone hummed loudly from the speaker, the sound of absolute, irrevocable abandonment. Preston Vance stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and vacant. The legendary Sterling family power, the untouchable Wall Street armor he had just bragged about, had not just failed him. It had actively participated in his execution. He was not just broke. He was betrayed by his own blood, fed to the federal authorities by the very man he thought would save him. Tariq calmly pressed the end call button and slipped the phone into his own pocket. He did not say a word. He did not need to gloat. He simply reached to the back of his belt and withdrew a pair of heavy stainless steel tactical handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound rang out through the silent restaurant like a funeral bell. Preston did not fight. The complete psychological destruction had drained every ounce of resistance from his body. He simply stared blankly at the floor, as Tariq grabbed his wrists, roughly twisting his arms behind his back. The metal cuffs ratcheted shut, locking tightly over the sleeves of his expensive suit. Preston Vance, Tariq, said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that commanded absolute compliance. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Preston let out a high, keening sob, his head drooping forward as Tariq held him firmly in place. I was completely broken, a ruined man, standing amidst the shattered pieces of his stolen life. The Caldwell family had been decimated. The money was gone. The reputations were destroyed. The prison sentences were secured. By all conventional metrics, the revenge was complete. But I did not move to leave. I did not signal Malik or Rosalind that our work was done. I stood exactly where I was, my eyes drifting from the pathetic handcuffed man in front of me back to Marcus Sr., who was still slumped on the floor staring blankly into the distance. Because the money was only the beginning. The financial ruin, the public humiliation, the federal indictments, those were merely the logistical mechanics of justice. Those were the necessary steps to strip them of their armor, so they could finally feel the true agonizing weight of what was coming next. This was never just about a stolen trust fund or a forged scholarship. This was never just about the 15 years of psychological torture I had endured under their roof. The true horror, the absolute foundational evil that tied my family to the Caldwells went far deeper than stolen millions. It was a debt paid in blood, buried under decades of lies, and tonight I was going to unearth the darkest secret of them all. Tonight we were finally going to talk about the brutal, unspeakable truth of the accident 25 years ago. Vivienne realized the financial ruin was only the prologue. The true terror was the secret she had buried a quarter of a century ago, stripped of her church titles, her offshore accounts, and her social armor. She crawled across the wine-soaked marble floor toward Judge Rosalind Montgomery. Her manicured hands, smeared with red wine, desperately grabbed at the hem of Rosalind's judicial robe. "Please, Rosalind," Vivienne sobbed, her voice a wretched guttural plea that echoed through the silent dining room. "I beg you, have mercy. Regardless of how it started, we gave her a home. We fed her. We raised her in luxury when you were lying in that hospital bed in a coma. It was just a terrible, tragic traffic accident. It was completely unintended. You cannot destroy us for a horrible mistake." Rosalind looked down at the woman who had stolen her entire life. If you looked closely into Rosalind's eyes, you would not see a stoic federal judge. You would see the primal, agonizing fury of a mother whose child had been ripped from her arms. Tears shimmered in her eyes, catching the light of the chandeliers, but they did not fall. They were instantly vaporized by a burning, absolute hatred. Rosalind did not speak immediately. She reached down and struck Vivian across the face with a slap so hard and vicious that the sound cracked through the room like a bullwhip. The force of the blow threw Vivian backward, sending her sprawling onto the hard marble. "A mistake!" Rosalind whispered, her voice vibrating with a lethal, terrifying intensity. "You want to call a hit and run a mistake, him?" she roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Marcus Sr., who was still slumped against his chair. He was driving that massive utility truck completely intoxicated. He ran a red light, smashed directly into my husband's car, and left him bleeding to death on the asphalt. He drove away to protect his budding real estate career, leaving me trapped in twisted metal, slipping into a coma. Marcus turned a sickly ash-gray color, his jaw dropping open as the ghosts he thought he had buried permanently rose from the grave to drag him to hell. "It was not a random adoption," Rosalind continued, stepping toward Marcus, her presence towering over him. "You did not just find an orphan. You tracked my insurance files. You used your administrative medical access at the hospital to monitor my coma. You knew my husband was dead. You knew I was not expected to wake up. You manipulated the system, forged the guardianship papers, and stole my infant daughter from the pediatric ward to secure a $15 million trust fund. You are not just a fraud, Marcus. You are a murderer and a kidnapper." The sheer gravity of the charges hit Marcus with the force of a freight train. Murder, kidnapping, federal embezzlement. He was going to die in a concrete cell. Pure adrenaline-fueled panic overrode his catatonia. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair, and bolted blindly toward the heavy oak exit doors of the Commerce Club. He did not care about his wife on the floor or his daughter screaming his name. He only wanted to escape. He slammed his heavy shoulder against the brass handles of the double doors, pushing with all his remaining strength. The doors did not budge. They were locked tight from the inside. Marcus whirled around his chest, heaving, his eyes wild with the frantic terror of a trapped animal. Standing in the shadows of the foyer, completely blocking the only exit, were 6 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with FBI emblazoned across the chest in bold yellow letters. Tariq had positioned them there before we even sat down to dinner. There was nowhere left to run. Marcus slammed his fists against the locked brass handles, sliding down the heavy wood, as the reality of the federal agents blocking the exit completely broke his spirit. The Alpha Patriarch was reduced to a whimpering, defeated shell. But the pathetic spectacle of the Caldwell family was not yet over. From the floor, Vivian made one final desperate play. The visual perspective of the room seemed to tilt, framing Vivian from a high, punishing angle. Stripped of her socialite arrogance, she looked incredibly small and pathetic, a groveling shadow of the woman who had terrorized my childhood. I stood directly above her, perfectly still, my posture radiating the absolute undisturbed calm of a deep lake. Vivian dragged herself across the spilled wine, her manicured fingers clawing at the hem of my skirt. She looked up at me, her face completely drenched in tears, pulling out the ultimate weapon in her arsenal of psychological manipulation. "Nia, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured maternal agony. "Look at me. I am your mother. You cannot do this to me. Think about all those years we spent together. Think about all those mornings I sat behind you and braided your hair before school. Think about the beautiful dresses I bought for you on your birthdays. We gave you a family. A mother's love is real, Nia. It is real. You cannot send your own mother to a federal prison," she wailed, clinging to my legs, desperately trying to evoke a bond that had only ever existed as a tool to control me. She expected anger. She expected me to scream, to cry, to list out her abuses, so she could twist them and play the victim one last time. Instead, I simply leaned down. There was absolutely no hatred in my eyes. There was no resentment left in my heart. There was only a profound freezing indifference, which was the absolute pinnacle of my revenge. Your love was a profitable investment, I said quietly, my voice devoid of any emotion. And I just liquidated the contract. I reached up to the back of my neck and unclasped the thin, delicate chain I had worn specifically for this occasion. It was the only gift Vivienne had ever given me, a supposedly expensive piece she had presented to me on my 16th birthday to impress her country club friends. I let the chain slip through my fingers. It hit the marble floor with a dull, hollow clink right next to her trembling hands. Gold-plated costume jewelry, I stated, looking down at the tarnished metal. Exactly like your affection. Vivienne stared at the cheap necklace, her mouth opening and closing without a sound, her final illusion completely shattered. Before she could summon another lie, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens shattered the silence of the night. Multiple cruisers screeched to a halt right outside the massive glass windows of the Commerce Club. The heavy red and blue strobes pierced through the darkness, washing over the dining room and illuminating the absolute despair on the faces of the Caldwell family. The heavy glass doors of the Commerce Club swung open, and a swarm of uniformed police officers and federal marshals flooded into the dining room, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floors. Tariq stepped back, handing Preston over to two marshals, who immediately forced the weeping executive toward the exit. The lead FBI agent stepped into the center of the wreckage, unfolding a thick stack of warrants. Marcus Caldwell and Vivienne. Caldwell, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, kidnapping, and vehicular manslaughter. The agent announced, his voice carrying absolute undeniable finality. Vivienne let out a piercing, hysterical scream as a female officer hauled her roughly to her feet, snapping steel handcuffs around her wrists. Marcus did not fight. He simply hung his head, his massive frame suddenly looking shriveled and frail as they dragged him away from the table. Preston followed closely behind them, a ruined man marching toward his own destruction. Chloe remained sitting in the puddle of spilled wine and shattered porcelain, completely untouched by the police, yet utterly destroyed. She looked around wildly, realizing she was entirely alone. No mansion, no husband, no trust fund, no legacy. I did not look at her again. I reached into my purse, pulled out my checkbook, and quickly filled out an amount more than sufficient to cover the ruined dinner, the shattered glasses, and the stained tablecloths. I dropped the crisp slip of paper onto the center of the table. I turned my back on the Caldwell dynasty and walked out of the restaurant, flanked by Tariq, Malik, and Rosalind. I was finally walking alongside my true family. The camera dollies backward, pulling away from the flashing police lights and the chaotic dining room, the image blurring for a fraction of a second before match-cutting seamlessly to the present. I am sitting comfortably on the plush velvet sofa in my own living room, the ambient lighting casting a warm, peaceful glow across the space. The storm has entirely passed. The justice system moved with surprising speed when presented with an airtight paper trail. I state, my voice steady and reflective. Marcus and Vivienne were found guilty on all charges. They were each sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Preston received 15 years for his role in the corporate embezzlement scheme. Chloe, stripped of her toxic collateral and left with mountains of personal debt, currently works the night shift as a cashier at a 24-hour pharmacy just to keep a roof over her head. I legally reclaimed my birth name, and my forensic accounting firm just opened its 4th national branch. I pick up a crystal glass of aged bourbon from the side table, swirling the amber liquid slowly as I look directly into the camera lens. People love to use the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," to justify toxic family loyalty. I say, a knowing smile touching my lips. But they always forget the actual complete proverb. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. The bonds we choose, the people who stand with us in the trenches, are infinitely stronger than the genetic lottery. I lean forward slightly, the amusement fading into absolute, unwavering conviction. Do not ever let the people who deliberately broke your wings convince you that the sky is too dangerous. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they have won. Sharpen your mind in the shadows, bide your time. And when the perfect moment finally arrives, do not just fly away. Buy the entire sky. I raise the crystal glass toward the lens. Cheers.